This is the last formal seminar of Public Sociology Live. We've been at this for about 3 months, and you may recall we began on January 25th, the anniversary of the Egyptian Revolution, and today is May 2nd, and yesterday across the globe, across the planet, there were demonstrations, protests around issues of inequality, marginalization, that some people in this class were involved in, and certainly many of the people who have appeared on this program participated in. So, Laleh and I are going to today try and summarize what has happened, and let me say this has been an experimental course, and first I'd like to thank the ETS, the Education Technology Services at Berkeley, for making this possible in this very experimental room. Gina's been with us all the entire time, helping to sort of moderate this very complicated story of sound. And also, really, it's great that we've been able to actually communicate not just among ourselves with public sociologists in different places, but we have engaged in a discussion. 7 classes around the world have engaged in a discussion about public sociology. And indeed, it has been a fascinating experience, and it's all registered on Facebook and will be sort of catalogued and is being catalogued on our blog. So this is really sort of very experimental, but I think this is probably in one way in which social media will represent sociology of the future. So let me now very quickly sort of summarize how we began with this idea of public sociology and its relationship to other forms of sociology. And then we'll get into a discussion of how all these 10 public sociologists intersect with this framework. Well, you'll remember that we start out with 2 questions. And the 2 questions, let me get this straight. All right. 2 questions. Knowledge for whom and knowledge for what? Knowledge for whom? Are we talking to an academic audience or an extra-academic audience? Knowledge for what? Are we concerned with means towards ends, or are we concerned with discussing the very ends of society? And we generated the sociological dream, and for some nightmare, the 2x2 table, as follows. And here we have professional and policy sociology, that's forms of instrumental knowledge, professional, aimed at an academic audience, concerned with solving puzzles in research programs, and extra academic audiences concerns the idea of policy sociology, in which we have in its sort of pure type, we have a client who establishes a certain problem that sociologists have to somehow tackle to solve, and that is the idea of policy sociology, as opposed to public and critical sociology. That's a form of reflexive sociology in which we discuss the values, norms of society. Critical sociology are sociologists talking to one another and first and foremost engaging, criticizing professional sociology and its foundations. Public sociology is a equivalent discourse between sociologists, a conversation between sociologists and publics, a two-way conversation that takes sociology beyond the academy. So that is the scheme that we have been working with the entire semester. So let me just say, just to remind all of you who we have had on this program, on this seminar series. We started with Manuel Castell's Communication Power. We moved on to Nandini Sundar, who talked about violence and democracy in India. Then we talked to Cesar Rodriguez Garavito, who talked about similar issues in Colombia. Then we moved on to Spain, where we talked to Marta Soler and Ramon Fletcher about critical communicative methodology, the dialogic approach. We then moved on to Walden Bello, who talked, remember, about the challenge of truth versus power. We then moved on to Carl van Holt, who got enmeshed in the dilemmas of policy sociology in South Africa. And then we moved on to Sari Hanafi, who talked about his engagements with the problems and projects of governing refugee camps in Lebanon. And then we moved to France, Michel Viviorca, who talked about the distinction between traditional, what we call traditional public sociology, and the actual production of sociology through sociological intervention. And then Punaider told us about the issues around Apple and Foxconn and the way sociologists engaged with the problematic character of employment conditions in Foxconn. And finally, we talked to Frances Fox Piven about her notions of interdependent power. So those are indeed our 10 public sociologists from around the world, and what we learned is that public sociology looks different in different places. So, all right, so that's the framework. Now, so the first question we asked was, who are sociologists talking to when they are public sociologists? What are their publics? We asked everybody this question. And what happened is that we made a distinction between the ideas of Michel Viviorca, who talked about the distinction between sociologists talking to wider publics through the media, through newspapers, radio, television. That's public sociology for him, as opposed to producing sociology. That's the professional sociology. That's on the one side. And then on the other side, we had Marta Soler and Ramon Fletcher talking about an unmediated relationship between the sociologist and their publics, what we called organic public sociology. So here we have the organic public sociology, the critical communicative methodology of CREA in Barcelona, as opposed to Michel Viviorca's traditional public sociology. Okay, very good. So the traditional public sociologist is concerned with communicating through the media to broad publics. And the organic public sociologist, using CCM in this case, was ultimately concerned, Ramon and Marta were concerned with actually influencing policy, for example, in relationship to the Roma people in the European Union. And finally, there is this other one issue that perhaps Laleh will talk about.
Yes. I think the interesting thing for me here is that, while the Viviorca and then Soler and Fletcher stand as these examples of traditional and organic public sociology, to the extent that for Viviorca, public sociology is about making sociology accessible, right? It's about disseminating sociology. And he distinguishes that from the production of sociological knowledge, whereas for Fletcher and Soler, that actually is part of doing public sociology, is that the publics engage in the production of that knowledge. That's not the case for Viviorca. So on the surface, it may seem that, this kind of traditional public sociology is a more kind of unidirectional flow to it, where the sociologist kind of bequeaths upon the public sociological knowledge. But Viviorca does he adds another layer with that notion that he talked about of sociological intervention, right, where publics actually have the final say on sociological analysis or on sociological theory. So in that sense, even in the traditional public sociology approach that Viviorca is using, he still sees a role that publics play in essence, there's an accountability to publics that can intervene and have a kind of final say about that knowledge. So even whether we're talking about traditional or organic public sociology, there's still a kind of, that arrow is going in both ways for both of them. There is a way in which publics come back to shape professional sociological knowledge, whether it's through actually being part of the production of that or whether it's through their role of intervening. So in that sense, for Viviorca, public sociology is kind of a mechanism that holds professional sociology accountable to publics. It has to make that knowledge accessible so that publics can speak back to it.
Very good. So that's the first set of questions around who are the publics that sociologists talk to and how do they relate to them. The second set of questions is to acknowledge that actually public sociology takes place in the real world, in a real context, in a public sphere populated by organizations that have differential power. And this becomes the power of context. Every public sociologist has to take into account who he or she is engaging with in the context within which that takes place. Manuel Castells was our first theorist of that context, and he talked about the communication power, the concentration of those entities, enterprises that dominated, concentration of communication power amongst particular conglomerates around the world. Part of his understanding of network society. And what he essentially argues is that communication is indeed very much central to the network society, communication power, and that in fact many parts of the world are switched out of these flows of power. This was a very different vision of the power of context to the one formulated by Frances Fox Piven. And she talked about interdependent power. And this is the idea that the dominated are not switched out, but they are part of a complex of cooperation, and as such they have the power to disrupt the people who dominate. And she had all sorts of interesting accounts of the ways that the dominated can exercise power of disruption. The question that we have before us then is, what is the significance of this for sociology?
Right. And so I think that these two different visions of power lead to two very different visions of public sociology, right? So to the extent, if you see things from the vision of Castells, where we live in a network society where most people are actually excluded from those relations of power, then the role of the public sociologist becomes one of using his or her privileged position within those networks or his or her communication power to advocate on behalf, perhaps, of excluded publics. But if you take a kind of Piven view where, even the most dominated, even the most marginalized communities are still hold this kind of power of disruption on the basis of how a larger system depends upon their cooperation, then the role of the public sociologist becomes kind of mapping out those relations of interdependence, making publics aware of their kind of interdependent power, and helping build capacity for essentially for disruption of those relations of interdependence.
Good. Well, perhaps are there any questions, interventions, any thoughts from any of you about these first two items? The different publics, the power of the context. Anybody got any thoughts? Yes?
Maybe just to reiterate, where does the power of the sociologist come from in Castell's vision through this communication power notion? It seems from what we read and from what we know about him that it's sort of an interdependence, but just like a network of interdependence.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. Laleh and I perhaps don't even quite agree. I mean, I think for Castells, remember what he said. He said that sociologists are not activists. I mean, public sociology is not activism. I mean, but he does talk about counterpower, and it's in the realm of counterpower, the sorts of things we are, in a sense and principle, doing in this class that sociologists can partake. I don't know what.
Yeah, but so Vidya, I mean, your question is what is, in that view, what's the role of the public sociologist? Where's the power of the public sociologist coming from?
Yeah.
So I mean, I think in that view, the power of the public sociologist comes from being within particular networks, right? So there might be a view from that vision of public sociology trying to develop those networks of public sociologists, right? And those linkages. And that communication power, right? So I think that the power of the sociologist comes from actually being within those networks, whereas he sees much of the rest of the world as being excluded from those networks.
Yeah, so the question is, whether is the sociologist in? Can we compete with these conglomerates that actually dominate communicate? And can we, through social media, sort of influence, switch in and out different groups? Yes.
So are they like the nodes? Like if your effectiveness as a public sociologist is based on your like greatness as a node?
Yes. Can one accumulate a sufficient power as a node? That's the question. So can sociologists do this? And that's what we have to think about when all these public sociologists, how effective have they been in communicating their ideas? And a lot of basically this course is about all the challenges that sociologists face in that regard. Yeah. Any other questions? Okie dokie, well then we should move on. So, all right, we just talked about the power of context. Now actually, there are populations in the world that really do seem to be switched out, what we call dispossessed populations. And a number of our public sociologists talked about them and their relationship to them, advocating for the dispossessed. So we might think here about displaced populations, whether they're refugees or displaced peasantries, displaced by sort of, it can be mining companies or dams. And so what role can the sociologist play in this context? How can sociologists advocate for the dispossessed?
So I think that obviously Hanafi is probably one of our best examples of that, right? So, we talked to Hanafi about his work on Palestinian refugee camps, and I think that what's interesting about Hanafi is the way in which he attempts to do this, to advocate for Palestinian refugees, in ways that integrate all these different types of sociology, right? So clearly, there's a core of professional sociology here in the sense that he's got this, within the university, he's got this, research project that's in a collaboration, and it's got researchers in various, refugee camps and in different host states doing this research. And at the same time, he's spending years working with UN agencies like UNRWA, attempting to shape policy on the basis of that professional research. And while he's doing both that professional and policy work, he's constantly attempting to make these critical interventions into sociological knowledge. And so, he's introducing these ideas like, space of exception or bare life as ways of really intervening in refugee studies, in the study of humanitarian agencies, right? So he's making those critical interventions. And of course, while doing all of this, he's also attempting to kind of, disseminate this beyond academia or policy circles. And so he takes on the role of the public sociologist, in part in a traditional way, right? Doing all kinds of work in media, writing accessible articles about what's going on. But also in organic ways of actually working with, working directly and quite actively with the publics that he's engaging with. And as he reminded us, which oftentimes, raises all kinds of dilemmas and challenges, and the difficulty of dealing with, what Bello might call inconvenient truths that may have some impact in policy, but are challenged in certain ways in the public. So I feel like Hanafi is a great example of attempting really to integrate all these things, but also the tensions and challenges that arise with that.
Right. And we can see similar things going on, for example, in Sundar's description of the Adivasi in Chhattisgarh. So this is now India, so this is the story, this is the account that Nandini Sundar offered us, and then we have there the blue spot in the bottom as the dispossessed. On the one hand, trapped between on the left-hand side, the Naxalites, sort of the left-wing guerrillas, and on the other side, a sort of vigilante force. It's often sponsored by the local state, the Chhattisgarh state, and using special police officers, SPOs. And Nandini actually had a sort of ethnographic relationship to the dispossessed, but now finds herself in a very difficult position vis-a-vis them, given the violence that surrounds the dispossessed. And so what does she do? Well, rather than engaging directly with the Adivasi, she in a sense, advocates for them, on the one hand, for the Supreme Court, and actually gets the Supreme Court to declare the Chhattisgarh government as unconstitutional, but it turns out, to her frustration, not making much difference, and at the same time also tries to propagate the understanding, a sociological understanding of the situation of the dispossessed in Chhattisgarh through the news media. That is indeed her project. And what is so interesting indeed is the combination of, on the one hand, a very violent context, but in an overarching democratic regime. And it is this intersection of violence and democracy that also we find in Colombia, which has had perhaps one of the longest traditions of democracy in Latin America, but at the same time is one of the most violent countries. And here we talked with Cesar Rodriguez Garavito about the Embera. And here we have a very similar story. The Embera saw a dispossessed population as a result of the flooding of their native lands. On the one side, trapped by the FARC, the sort of left-wing guerrilla movement, who has actually recently declared peace, but the peace is clearly not going to stick, it doesn't look like anyhow. So on the one side, and on the other side, the paramilitary sponsored by landowners and by the state. And there is Cesar, similar to Nandini, in the middle of this very violent context, what to do. His strategy is actually to invoke a relationship to NGOs that are actually pursuing the human rights of the dispossessed, the Embera, and in the framework, and this is what is interesting, of a global legal order, an international legal order sponsored by the UN and the ILO. One of the most important of these legislations is something called IPIC. FPIC, very good. Thank you very much, Micah. FPIC, which stands for, let's see if you remember this. What do you remember what it stands for? Anybody remember what FPIC stands for? Micah?
Free, prior, informed consent.
Brilliant. Free, prior, informed consent. So that essentially, in principle, according to this international law, what has to happen? Namely, the multinational corporations who want the land for mining or to build dams, they have to consult with the potentially dispossessed. I mean, that's not a great breakthrough, but even that is very difficult to engineer. So anyway, so what is interesting here is that Cesar Rodriguez Garavito is actually moving beyond the nation state to an international legal order to sort of put pressure on the Colombian government to actually enforce international law.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think, there's a bunch of similarities between the two of them, but I think one thing that really pops out at me is how both of them illustrate that public sociology oftentimes necessarily becomes a collective enterprise, because both of them their work involves working with many other people, not only other scholars, but let's say journalists, lawyers, NGOs, activists, so the way that they talked about their work involved, not only working with all kinds of people, but also ultimately a good deal of institution building, that was central to what they did. Garavito talked a lot about the various institutions that he had set up, and Sundar as well talked about, creating organizations of scholars and journalists and, advocates essentially for dispossessed populations in India. So one thing we see is, not only the collective nature of the work, the institution building, but also one way to look at that is that both of them are ultimately engaged in attempting to build publics, right? So in Sundar's case, building publics of concerned scholars, etc., or in Garavito's case, trying to build publics across national boundaries, right? So groups that are working on issues of dispossession or of indigenous rights in different countries in Latin America, trying to actually build connections institutionally to create more kind of regional publics. Mm-hmm. So in both those cases.
Yeah. Anybody got any thoughts about this? Very quiet today. I know it's exam week, so or nearly exam week. Daveen, you're stretching, or you've got a question?
No. I think what they show us is, one of the things I always think is really interesting about these two is how, when we talk about how public sociology looks different in different places, and how violence adds another tension or another reality to the work they do on top of all these things about creating publics and trying to disperse information, connect globally or locally, how they're in a state of violence and how that adds a whole nother like survival or realistic barrier to the work they do and how it's
Right.
another layer that I don't think a lot of
Right.
sociologists we've talked about, all of them dealt with it and how
Very
that
good.
changes the nature of the work they do
Yeah.
and
That's-
how they and the limitations of how they can interact with the different publics.
Right. And sort of questions, for example, both, you might say Viviorka, who's sort of communicating with the media, but also Fletcher and Soler with their sort of critical communicative methodology, right? It makes that quite difficult to undertake. Yeah. So they tell us a lot. Sociologists have difficulty dealing with violence, but violence is actually sort of very much present in so many places in the world, and something we have to come to grips with as sociologists, as professionals and as public sociologists. Like that.
It also sort of seems like there's a relationship between like the violence that they're dealing with and like the corruption of the state, because didn't both of them have like failed Supreme Court cases, you know? So I'm not really exactly even sure what that means, but I just think it's interesting that they're sort of like feeding off of each other.
Right. Yes. Yes. I mean, what is the character of the democracy in Colombia and India if the state actually ignores what the Supreme Court says? I mean, that's yes, and the challenges that poses. Both take this legal route, but in the end, they take it in a sense, but it turns out to be not altogether very effective. Yeah, yeah.
Well, sort of on that point, both of these groups have the influence of like communist parties, which are to represent the people, but then the state is also an entity to represent the people, and it's interesting that these are both not really doing their role in like protecting the people, and there's a fight between them that's leaving their subjects in the middle and kind of unrepresented and like at the sake of violence, just internal fighting.
Yeah. So what does representation mean in these contexts? Very difficult to sustain, yeah.
Well, and also who can protect them
Yeah.
if those two groups that are both supposed to
Yeah,
be
well, that's why, of
protected.
course, Garavita goes to the NGOs, goes to the international legal order. And actually, Sundar is sort of knows about this and thinks that is the way to go. She thinks also that is the way to go forward, that they haven't taken it in India. Yeah, yeah. So there are groups then who are really, perhaps don't have interdependent power, and perhaps are in some sense switched out. They're not invisible, but they are. It's difficult for them to partake in politics. Yeah.
Well, it sort of reminds me of the Palestinian people when Hanafi says that they're considered under the law, but they're not like protected by the law. So these people are like both pawns of the law, but they're not given the protection because both of them are kind of fighting against each other.
Right.
Right, yeah, no, Hanafi's idea of state of exception would apply in both
That's
of these
right.
cases, right? So in a sense, from that vision of seeing this as a state of exception, you know, it makes sense why Hanafi wouldn't be pursuing legal means, right? And in both these cases, whether at a national Supreme Court level or at an international level, you're attempting to advocate or through these kind of legal means, but yet, as you're pointing out, the actual on the ground, the context there is very much a state of exception where things are extra legal in so many ways.
That's right. So, I mean, so you can see we've now talked a little bit about the dilemmas of Sundar and Garavito and Hanafi, and you know, but they are as Garavito said, they are in a constant turmoil. There is he sort of drew the analogy between their experiences and a windmill. You remember, there's the windmill, and notice the windmill has 4 blades, right? And the 4 blades represent, of course, professional, public, critical, and policy sociologists. And what these sociologists are saying, is that it's very difficult to sustain their projects because it looks like this. Let's see. Yes. So they feel they're in the gale force wind that's driving their blades around, the blades of the four sociologies. And what is important, I should say, is this institutional foundation, the plinth of the windmill is so essential, as Laleh was saying, to their projects that holds the whole thing together. You can't do public sociology by yourself. You've got to do it as a collective enterprise. And I think that is one of the lessons that we have learned. Okay, very good. So now, given the difficulty of engaging in public sociology, the necessity of actually simultaneously being professional public policy and critical sociologists, some people get so frustrated that they are driven beyond public sociology to activism. Yes. So, holding on to this project of combining these four knowledges can often lead to burnout. And so some sociologists turn to activism. So we saw this very powerfully present in this sort of very honest presentation of Walden Bellow. You remember Bellow? He was talking, his projects have been against multilateral agencies, the World Bank, WTO. And he starts with a sort of critical knowledge, the truth, what he calls the truth. Critical knowledge, which in the particular context he's talking about now, is a particular understanding of what we might call neoliberalism, what I sometimes call third wave marketization, that we are now living in since for the last 30, 40 years. And he starts with this critical knowledge, critical of professional knowledge, particularly sort of modernization theory in sociology, or sometimes neoclassical economics. And so that's the truth is against professional knowledge. But the truth is also against the policy world that is founded upon the professional knowledge. And he believes that actually that truth can really, of the critical knowledge, can really be only made real through an engagement directly with the publics, with social movements such as the movement that emerged in 1999 around the World WTO meeting in Seattle. And so that then is that project of Walden Bellow, truth against power. And you remember how he sort of even says you even have to sort of go and search out your own knowledge. Knowledge itself is a bit tainted, so you have to, and he actually justifies going in and invading the World Bank to get knowledge. There are other unorthodox way of gathering data, I might say. But very important in the eventualities based on the book that he wrote that contributed to the overthrow of the Marcos regime. So on the one hand, so then on the other hand, we have, remember, Poonah. Well, it's not so long ago, 2 weeks ago, she told us very much about the way that sociologists, critical knowledge that she had gleaned from her own ethnographic work into workplaces, factories in China, and how that had sort of been used, and how she developed that as a critique of the sort of the public relations understanding of what happens in factories. And she had tried to then actually sort of generate a research project that actually sort of revealed the character of Foxconn and its employment practices, and tried then to push Apple, to shame Apple into trying to monitor what goes on its suppliers, particularly Foxconn. And that failing, she then sort of moved into the public realm, and we heard her telling us how important it was to, on the one hand, to organize consumers, to, in fact, reveal the employment strategies of Foxconn, particularly the employment of indentured students, and on the one side and on the other side to sort of begin to try and organize struggles within China against these employment strategies. So, so this is, but this was already a movement away from public sociology, perhaps to a more activist project. And the question is this: what is the difference between public sociology and activism? And thank God I don't have to answer that question. Laleh.
Yeah, I don't know that I can answer it either, but that is the burning question, I think. this fine line or this blurry line between public sociology and activism. And for some scholars, that blurriness of that line is more acceptable. For others, they're more insistent that there has to be a clear demarcation. But I think this issue is important because that's one of the kind of vulnerabilities of public sociology, right, is that it's open to this critique of it just being a slippery slope that becomes activism. And many of the scholars that we spoke to could be accused of that. But clearly, Bello and Punai, are among the more extreme cases. And I think that one of the important things that surfaces in Punai's case is that, there may be all kinds of repercussions for a sociologist who kind of, flirts with activism. But I think that those repercussions, they look different in different places, right? Mm-hmm. So for some scholars, let's say in the US, the repercussions of that may be, a decline in your professional standing, not being taken seriously professionally, et cetera. But in other parts of the world, being outed as an activist and not a real scholar may have much more serious consequences, right? Possibly, let's say, in Punai's case. So that's, I think, one important issue is that slippery slope has different consequences for different sociologists in different parts of the world. And then we can, look at Bello, who, is in a way is not as concerned about that distinction, but is also, is clearly kind of unabashedly breaking the rules of sociology and even inciting us to do so, right? It's very clear that there's a relationship between truth and power, and as Piven might say, the rules of sociology, reflect the dominant order and the status quo. So to the extent that we always abide by the rules of method or the boundaries of sociology, then we're not really able to challenge those power relations. So in a way, actually, Bello is invoking us really to push those boundaries and reject some of the rules of those boundaries.
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
So, yeah, because I'm kind of confused to see, the whole, contrast of activism and, public sociology, and public sociology, and then, I guess even further, because since it's a public sociology class, we've never really, defined activism, so it's, are there, sides, the way there's traditional public sociology and there's organic public sociology, is there, kind of traditional and organic activism as well,
Well,
Traditional activism would be lobbying, no?
I think we have to put the word political in front of activism. So it's public sociology and political activism. And analytically, I agree with everything that Laleh says. But analytically, to distinguish between the two, public sociology is part of the sociological field. Its immediate engagement is with policy sociology, but also professional and critical sociology. Whereas once you move into political activism, you're operating in a political field. And I think that's the border you're crossing. So in a sense, when Piven moves into political activism, it means that she's thinking about the political field. She's thinking about how parties are organized in the United States. She's thinking about how to advance immediately the voting capacity of the underprivileged.
But isn't that sometimes the role of the public sociologist as well? Because a lot of times legislation and everything in policy is going to be directly related to
Yeah, but I think that ultimately, yes. Yeah, I think ultimately the public sociologist is as accountable, you might say, to the sociological field. It is the reference point. Ultimately, still is the sociological field, where the activist is, in a sense, accountable to and operates within the political field. So now, that's it.
Sorry, go ahead.
It's a fine line.
Yeah.
Yes, it is indeed. Dominica.
Yeah, I think this line is also very important for Sundar. So she was really emphasizing that she does not want to be associated with activism, with political activism. So she wants to remain objective and credible in academia. And she really emphasized this. It was somehow very important for her as a real professional sociologist. So I think it can become dangerous in some contexts to be associated with one of the parties. In her case, it was the Maoists. I think that relates back to the point of like the consequences of being related to activism versus public sociology. Is that I think when you think of the consequences that Nandini can possibly face by going into the spaces where she's being followed and she has to watch who she's talking to, maybe being connected to activism means something else there than it maybe means in the Philippines for
Right, very good. And also, whoa, we got lots of hands up here. Well, all right, Diana.
I'm going to relate this even further back into how we speak about public sociology as a collective enterprise. Because you're working with so many different organizations, you have to kind of appease to some, and you can't exactly piss off the others. Otherwise, you have to keep that balance. Otherwise, you
Right.
get discredited.
So you're always, in a sense, operating in a political field, even if you're not accountable to it. Yeah. Vidya.
Well, and also arguing what New York has said about being like in France, being an intellectual is seen to be a good thing, whereas here it may be seen as like a bougie thing
Right.
that people don't want to be.
Right.
And so just like the impression that intellectuals have in affecting change might be different in countries where change kind of happened a long time ago and now it's more gradual, and so affecting these more dramatic changes is seen to be like counter-revolutionary or whatever.
Yeah, I think the key to what Vidya is saying, though, is that the type of, let's say, public sociologist that any given scholar is not just a matter of the choices they make and the positions they take, but the specific national institutional context in which they work. Because for some of these scholars, actually their professional position, like maybe Hanafi or Sundar, that professional position as a scholar may in fact be like an important buffer that enables all these other forms of actions, right? So in each case, which is a totally different situation than Viviorca in France, right? So I think in all those, it's that location makes a big difference to the type of sociology that can be pursued.
Did you hand that, Naima?
Yeah, but can you also say within public sociology, when you're talking about the fine line of activism, you can also question like the for whom and for what. Like in terms of if it's like the political field, it's just like it's really specific, and then like to me, activism within public sociology is to disrupt the system, not just anything specific, but like the system itself. Because what we're studying ultimately is systems.
Yeah, but studying is one thing, disrupting it is something else. I mean, if one thinks about disrupting it, one often thinks about how does one do it in the context of the particular set of political relations outside the university. Though, of course, as Devine says, I mean, a number of you said, sometimes the university is in politics, not outside politics. You can't sort of separate the two. So in a country like the Soviet Union, the university was indeed part and parcel of the political order, so this distinction between a public sociology and a political activism was unsustainable. So it's very contextually specific. But I think, yeah, all right, we should move on, right? All right, well, as I say, the course hasn't ended. We've got plenty of time to discuss these matters. Okay, so one way is to go into political activism with your frustrations. The other is to retreat into professional sociology. And Carl Van Holt's going to kill me for saying all this, but nevertheless we are saying, Lali and I agreed on this one, right? Mm-hmm. Good, okay, I got some support. Okay, so basically Carl starts out in the policy world. It's a fascinating story of the transformation of the post-apartheid state. And he's talking about one of the biggest hospitals in the world, the Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto. And so there he is. Now, well, the question is, what sort of policy sociology is it that he's involved in? In the beginning, he starts out with the sort of the research arm of the Federation of Trade Unions, COSATU, and sort of advocacy. But he's always on the borderlands between an advocacy or policy sociology in which there is autonomy for the sociologist and sponsored policy sociologist in which you are doing what your client wants you to do. So there is this tension all the time between the two as he tries to partake in the reorganization of Baragwanath Hospital. But what he does at certain points is to try and invoke he, and not just himself, but he and Naledi, the Research Institute, to invoke connections to publics to support their project that is stalling within the hospital. So they reach out to publics, they appeal to publics, and we might call that a sort of public sociology, though. All right, fine, let's move on. Okay, yes, so that's one strategy. And then from the public sociology, he realizes even that the publics that he is invoking, the doctors, the trade unionists, the workers, there's really still, there's a certain conservatism that is difficult to overcome in this hospital. And so he sits back and thinks very critically about what has happened. And then he decides in the end to to retreat even further into the university, heads the new institute, swap of social research, and it's not to say that he gives up the critical public and policy sociology, but needs that space to understand the complexities of actually seeking to transform the post-apartheid state. Yes, right. So, yes.
I do think it's retreat or a refuge, right? And it kind of indicates that, the efforts of all these other kinds of sociological efforts, just how challenging and chaotic and the dilemmas that they raise, the difficulty of engaging in all of that is, makes it quite tempting to be able to retreat into a kind of professional world, to be able to actually analyze and make sense of those things, right? So for von Holt, it was like that really the only way of attempting to make sense of what had just happened was to be able to take that analytic space that professional sociology enabled for making sense of it, which I think gets a little bit at the centralness of professional sociology to all of this, that the ways in which all of these efforts are kind of based upon that. But it also, the arrows go in all those directions. I think the other important thing is as people move around, as they retreat into professional after making these policy efforts or whatever it is, the important thing is that these different types of sociological knowledge are being infused into the other kind of fields, right? So when von Holt engages in that policy effort, in that public sociology project, and then returns to professional sociology to make sense of it, though that knowledge then kind of gets infused into professional sociology. So even though for him as an individual sociologist, this whole experience probably involved a lot of frustration and tension, in a larger kind of, when you look at the field, there's this kind of integration and way in which the different kinds of sociology come to fuel each other, actually, and nourish each other.
Right. So in a sense, the professional sociology is ultimately at the core of the sociological project, including public sociology, in a way that, of course, it is not the core of a political activism. Yes. Very good. All right. So, well, we are running out of time, as we always do, but yes, Raymond.
So, but would that kind of make it like a critical sociology then? If the fact that you're bringing like this like knowledge that's been acquired from, from like hands-on research in public sociology, and then, if you're bringing it back into professional sociology, then you're kind of like critiquing.
Absolutely. And so, Raymond, think about Hanafi is a perfect example of that, right? So he's, working with like the UN and with these agencies, and actually seeing on the ground kind of what the realities are of that policy approach, right? And that's what enables him to then go back into sociology and have these concepts of bare life, right? That a humanitarian approach that just tries to minimally feed and shelter people without actually pursuing any political right for them renders them as bare life, right? So he's taking that into, as a critical intervention into sociological understandings of the way that humanitarian aid works, right? And making a really critical intervention that comes from his policy experience and from his public sociology experience.
And equally von Holt, he brings an understanding of organizations in a particular context. So organization theory, in as much as it sort of abstracts from the context, is being subject to a criticism, not being able to take into account the specificities of the post-apartheid state, and particularly what we talked about a lot, remember, race. Right? So there is a critical infusion through his engagement in the world. And that is indeed how sociology develops, through these critical infusions from engagements in the world beyond. Well, yes, indeed. Well, okay. Any other question? Okie dokie, we got 7 minutes and we're into conclusion. Okay, well you begin, Laleh, on conclusion.
Wow. Okay, so
There's our conclusion.
There's our conclusion, right? Yeah, you know, I think that, I mean, in reflecting on this course, right, and on these seminars, the one thing that is clear is that there's such a great diversity of visions of public sociology, right? I mean, we saw so many different visions of what the work of a public sociologist could be. And they range from, you know, public sociology as a vision of kind of more traditional kind of public intellectual position, right, of disseminating the knowledge of sociology to the public, a vision of, you know, that public sociology as advocate for those groups, a vision of public sociologists as a legal advocate, as a policy advocate, as somebody who actually goes in and co-produces knowledge with publics, right? Even visions of you know, the public sociologist as an activist or as somebody that offers sociological knowledge to publics to help them, you know, kind of expand their disruptive potential even, or their organizational capacity. So it was a real diversity. What's interesting to me though is that all of these scholars, what is clear is that their sociological training, no matter what kind of directions they go in, that sociological training is so central to the work they do. So, you know, even if we were to go through this group of people and you know, classify, oh, this one is, you know, a policy analyst, and this one's a public intellectual in France, and, you know, whatever, this one's just an activist, this one's a legal advocate, but yet they're all sociologists, and that comes through no matter what their work is.
Mm-hmm. So what is this sociology, this centrality of sociology? Well, remember we began by saying the world is in a mess, and we understood this mess to be very much the result of the sort of sort of like a pincer movement of state and economy, state and market, that is destroying so many societies. And I don't think what we've learned this semester sort of, in any way, it really challenges that vision of what is happening. So many of the people we talk to are in fact engaging precisely the challenge of the state and market combining to destroy society. And sociology, because it takes the perspective of civil society, actually in a sense has in a good place both to understand the world from the point of view of society, but also in a sense to build a relationship to publics that will in the end defend society. And that again is this movement from public sociology, you might say, to a form of political activism. So what is really been really, I think, amazing and I think very inspiring is to actually listen and watch all these 10 public sociologists with their vision of sociology and taking it and engaging the world beyond the academy. It's an extraordinary commitment. It's not clear what the effects are, but they are all inspiring in their determination and the sacrifices many of them make in order to actually bring sociology to a wider community and to try and translate the ideas of sociology in a defense of society. And I think what this course has done, and I should, by the way, as a digression, I should say that these 10 beautiful pictures have been drawn by Kaylee Benko, who's sitting next to me.
Yeah.
Yes. And while I'm in the realm of thanks, I should also like to thank the 7 classes around the world, as well as the students in this class for their amazing participation that will continue. I think, in fact, it's very important that we do continue. One of the lessons I've learned, I think, is the importance of public sociologists must communicate with one another. We have all a lot to learn from one another, the different strategies, not just in our societies, but globally. We have to build community, not just in the immediate context in which we operate, but across nations, to think about the different strategies we deploy in different places. And that has been indeed the purpose of this course. And what I hope is that this course, in a sense, will continue, and I'm hoping that, in fact, other places in the world will construct similar courses, similar communications. And I'm hoping that we will continue to actually communicate on Facebook, on the blog, and perhaps we'll actually even people will in different places contribute videos with their own local public sociologists that we will then actually post on the website that we have begun. So let me thank everybody, those here and those who are not here, for this amazing course that has brought together a whole plurality of ideas around public sociology and inspired us, I think, to take it forward. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.